The Zoot riots were a series of violent clashes during which mobs of U.S. servicemen, off-duty police, officers, civilians, they brawled with young Latinos and other minorities in LA. To understand the Zoot riots, we really need to look into the political environment and also the social and economic conditions of Chicanos at that time. But wartime patriotism didn't help matters. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was forced to enter into World War II. Wool and other textiles were subject to strict rationing. The U.S. War Production Board regulated the production of civilian clothing containing silk, wool, and other essential fabrics. Most Mexican Americans were living in barrios, that's in Spanish neighborhoods, in English that means the hood, the slums. And they were also living in segregated situations. They had to attend segregated schools, they were living outside. If you have to understand that they were embedded in the U.S. system in isolation and marginalization, where whites viewed them as foreigners. Moreover, the migration of Mexican Americans into the cities took place from the 1930s to the 1940s, and that really contributed to a significant development of the Pachuco subculture. And the Pachuco subculture provided the means for young Mexican Americans to resist the prejudice and inequalities in the U.S. at that time. At that time, because of the economic boom, a lot of these teenagers were spending money and they became infatuated with the music. Jazz was the cool thing at that time, and they started wearing the suits. And they spoke a slang language that is known as caló. We still hear many of us using chale instead of saying no, and there's some of that that still resonates with the language that some of the Zoot legacy is still in the barrios. But the Zoot was popularized by Cab Calloway, who in his hipster dictionary he called the Zoot the only American civilian suit. So these young Chicanos became known as Pachucos, often wearing flashy suits, pork pie hats, and dangling watch chains, were viewed by affluent whites in LA as gang members. And also the media contributed to that stereotype. The word Pachuco is really hard to trace down. One theory claims that the term originated in El Paso, Texas. The city of El Paso was typically referred to as Chuco Town or El Chuco, and people moving from Los Angeles to El Paso would say they were going pa El Chuco, means to Chuco Town, and these migrants came to be known as Pachucos. But Pachucos in LA, in San Diego, were accused of being terrorists. At that time, there was a political movement called anarchism. And this movement opposed communism, liberalism, and also the values of the U.S. It supported these hardcore fascist dictators like Francisco Franco, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. By 1941, synarchism was so popular there was about 1 million members, and the U.S. and Mexico were afraid they were infiltrating both countries and also doing hardcore espionage. So what really happened in that summer of 1943? Tensions were very tense between suiters and servicemen around the city of LA. And most of these sailors who came from different parts of the U.S. have never seen Mexicanos, who saw them as foreigners, or they saw them as they were dodging not to go to World War II. But the reality is that a lot of them were too young to be drafted. On May 31st, a clash between a sailor and a Mexican American resulted in the beating of a U.S. sailor, and this became a huge deal. About 50 sailors from local U.S. Naval Reserve Armory came through downtown LA carrying clubs and attacking anyone that was wearing a suit. And not only that, there were a lot of blacks and Filipinos who got beaten just by being black and being Filipino. The governor at that time, Earl Warren, created or appointed a committee to investigate the Zoot riots. The committee reports found that in undertaking to deal with the cause of these outbreaks, the system of race prejudice cannot be ignored. I wanted to close with these riots that took place in 1943 during World War II. Maybe it resonates with Black Lives Matter, the riots in the U.S. Capitol. Are we still fighting with racism? How we overcome racism in the U.S.? And that's why you take classes like this. Ethnic studies, Chicano studies, whether you take African American studies or Asian American studies, they all tell the story from those who have endured a long process of racism, isolation, and marginalization. I wanted to close with this, and I hope you enjoy the small lecture and the video clip that goes along with the Zoot riots. Take care.